A father stood frozen as the son he raised, the boy he sacrificed everything for, mocked him in front of a crowd. Years of love and loyalty were ripped apart in a single moment of public humiliation, and the laughter cut sharper than any knife. He had stayed silent too long, swallowing the insults, carrying the weight alone. But that night something inside him broke, and something else awakened. This was no ordinary wound. This was betrayal at its cruelest. What he uncovered afterward would not only silence his enemies, it would make him unforgettable. Don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from. Robert Hayes lived in silence, a silence he had long since made peace with. The tools in his garage whispered the rhythm of his life. Hammers and chisels lined neatly on the pegboard, wood shavings scattered across the workbench like fallen leaves. Each morning he woke in the same small house in Burlington, Vermont, where the kettle hissed on the stove and the floorboards groaned under his tired steps. He didn't need much. The world outside could race ahead with its flashing screens and endless noise. He was content with the sound of the wind pressing against the old siding, with the smell of pine carried in from the hills. What kept his heart alive wasn't the quiet itself, but the thought of Daniel, the boy who had once filled this house with laughter, the grandson who had called him Papa, with a voice that used to melt away every shadow. Daniel had been left in his care when Michael, Robert's son, was barely a man himself, working double shifts and struggling to stay afloat. So Robert became more than a grandfather. He was the steady hand guiding a boy across cracked pavement on his first bicycle, the patient voice teaching him how to measure twice before cutting once, the man who showed him that real strength came not from raising your voice, but from keeping your word. In those early years, the house pulsed with life. The smell of pancakes drifted from the kitchen, baseball gloves sat on the porch, and Buddy, their golden retriever, bounded through the yard chasing sticks. But time is a thief. Childhood wonder gave way to glowing screens. The boy who once carved toy soldiers out of scrap wood beside him in the garage grew distant, eyes glued to a phone, laughter reserved for friends Robert never met. Social media took the place of backyard games. Earbuds drowned out conversations at the dinner table. And slowly Robert learned the art of stepping back. He told himself it was normal. Kids grew up. They changed. Yet behind his quiet smile, he carried a splinter of grief. Even as Daniel drifted, Robert never stopped believing in him. He remembered the little boy who sketched houses with crayons, who once said he wanted to design buildings that would touch the sky. Architecture. That had been the dream. Robert clung to it as if keeping it alive might keep Daniel's heart tethered to something real. For 12 long years, he sacrificed from the meager pension he collected each month. He clipped coupons with shaky hands, skipped meals so the boy could have new cleats, turned down the thermostat in winter to save a few extra dollars. Every sacrifice slipped quietly into an envelope labeled college fund. He guarded it like a treasure, not for himself, but for the boy he loved more than his own comfort. It wasn't just about money. Robert wanted Daniel to know that someone believed in him enough to suffer in silence for his future. But money is invisible until it is spent, and love is invisible until it is tested. On the eve of Daniel's 18th birthday, Robert decided that the boy would need more than a check in an envelope. He would need a reminder of where he came from, a token carved from memory itself. In the corner of the garage, Robert began his work. He traced the shape of their old backyard swing, the oak tree still standing tall in his mind, the dog that had long since gone to the earth, the flowers that had once brightened the windowsill each spring. He carved with aching wrists and eyes blurred by age, but each cut of the chisel was a heartbeat. When the model was finished, he sanded it smooth, stained it until the wood gleamed, and tied it with a satin ribbon. The gift was more than wood. It was history made tangible, proof of a bond that had once been unbreakable. He slipped a small card beneath the ribbon. It read, "May your future be as steady as the roots beneath this tree." The day of the party arrived. Robert ironed his one good shirt, brushed his thinning gray hair, and carried the box like glass. But the moment he stepped beneath the white tent, he knew he was in foreign territory. This wasn't the kind of celebration he remembered. Gone were the backyard barbecues with paper plates and lemonade. Instead, linen tables gleamed under strings of lights. A catered buffet sprawled with dishes he couldn't pronounce. A DJ blasting music too loud for conversation. Around the gift table, designer bags towered like monuments to money. Robert stood in his old cardigan at the edge of the crowd, a stranger in his own family. When Daniel finally began opening gifts, cameras flashed and phones recorded. He tore through glossy boxes, watches, cash envelopes, gadgets stacked high in their shiny wrappers. Then his hand paused on Robert's package, humble brown paper tied with ribbon. For a moment the tent quieted. "This one's from my papa," Daniel said. And for a flicker, Robert thought maybe the boy's voice still held warmth. He was wrong. Daniel tore away the paper and held up the carved model. A laugh cut through the silence. "Are you serious? A wooden swing? That's it? Must have been cheaper than buying something real." The kids around him snickered. Someone muttered, "Vintage, I guess." The model, weeks of effort, years of memory, was propped carelessly against the table leg like a discarded toy. The crowd moved on, chasing the next glossy thrill. No one saw Robert's face. That was the thing about being invisible. No one notices when you're bleeding. He walked out without a word. Each step felt heavier, as if he were dragging the weight of every winter he had shivered through to save a few dollars. Every holiday he had spent alone, while Daniel laughed elsewhere. Every silent prayer he had whispered over bills, so the boy could have one more chance. In the car, he gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on his hands. A tear slid down and splashed on the wedding band he still wore, though his wife had been gone for years. The house he returned to that night was darker than usual. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. The silence wrapped around him, not as comfort, but as a cruel reminder. He poured water into a chipped mug and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once guided Daniel's hands over math homework, where the boy had once colored pictures of houses with crayons and told him, "Papa, one day I'll build something big for you." Robert looked at the corner where his tools still sat, the brushes and wood stains left over from his carving. He thought of the gift lying forgotten under the party table, the laughter that had followed it, the cruel ease with which love had been dismissed as cheap. Something hardened in him that night. It wasn't rage, not the kind that shouted or broke things. It was quieter, sharper. He opened the drawer where the college fund folder sat, thick with records of every sacrifice. He logged into his old desktop computer, typed the same password he had used for 12 years, and stared at the balance. Every dollar represented a night of hunger, a winter of cold, a pair of boots worn longer than they should have been. With steady fingers, he clicked transfer. The money slid from the account meant for Daniel into his own. Not for revenge, not out of spite. It was something else, something he had denied himself for far too long. For once, he chose himself. He made tea properly this time, with honey, and sat in the quiet. No guilt gnawed at him. No second thoughts clawed their way in. Only the absence of chaos, a strange quiet in his chest that felt almost like peace. But peace never lasts. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message. Daniel wanted to visit. He used the old name, Papa, as if it could erase the night before. Robert stared at the screen for a long time, the words blurred by the memory of laughter, of humiliation. He didn't answer right away. And when Daniel arrived hours later, smiling too brightly, arms full of expensive bakery cookies, his voice dripping with apology, Robert watched him closely. He listened to every word, every practiced inflection, and wondered if it was real. He wanted to believe. He wanted to melt the way he always had. But somewhere deep down, a question burned sharper than any apology. What if the laughter was only the beginning, and the betrayal had layers yet to be revealed? And that question, heavy as stone, lingered in the air, pulling him toward the truth he had not yet seen, the truth waiting just beyond the next moment. Robert became more than a grandfather the day Michael dropped off Daniel with a diaper bag and an apology. Michael was young, barely steady on his own feet, and already drowning under the weight of bills and double shifts. So Robert did what men of his generation always did. He shouldered the burden without complaint. The boy stayed, and Robert's quiet house began to pulse with life again. The cracked driveway became Daniel's first racetrack, his bicycle wobbling under nervous legs as Robert jogged behind, one calloused hand steadying the seat. Every scraped knee was patched with gauze and gentle words. Every tumble met not with scolding, but with patience. The smell of marigolds lingered on their hands as they planted rows in the front yard. A splash of orange and gold against the weathered boards of the porch. And in the garage, sawdust floated like summer dust motes while Daniel carved beside him, a child's hands clumsy on the chisel but determined, guided by Robert's steady presence. The boy became the center of his world. When Daniel laughed, the walls of the little house seemed younger, stronger. When he slept curled up with Buddy, the old golden retriever, Robert stood in the doorway longer than he needed to, memorizing the peace on his grandson's face. He began to think in terms of we instead of I. Grocery lists, holiday plans, even the long Vermont winters all revolved around the boy who had been handed to him by circumstance, but claimed by him with love. Life wasn't easy, not for a widowed carpenter living on odd jobs and a pension, but Robert had weathered harder storms. He patched leaky roofs, stretched every dollar until it groaned, and never let Daniel see how tight things really were. To the boy, childhood was full of wooden soldiers, pancake breakfasts, and bedtime stories told in the low rumble of a voice that carried more comfort than any nightlight. Robert gave him all the things Michael, despite his best efforts, couldn't provide: consistency, gentleness, roots. As Daniel grew, Robert watched with quiet pride. He cheered from the sidelines of Little League games, whistled when the boy raced across the finish line in school track, clapped the loudest at school plays. Every victory, no matter how small, felt like redemption for the sacrifices Robert made. He had raised his own children with sternness, softened by love. But with Daniel there was something different, something second chance about it, as if life had allowed him to rewrite old mistakes with new tenderness. But as the years stretched on, shadows began to creep into the edges of that bond. It started small. Weekends when Daniel chose friends over family dinners, nights when the boy sat hunched over a glowing screen instead of joining him in the garage. The crayons gave way to iPads, the toy soldiers to earbuds. Robert told himself it was natural. The teenagers were supposed to drift. He tried not to take it personally when Daniel brushed past him without more than a muttered "hey," or when laughter was shared with voices on the other end of a phone instead of in the same room. Yet the distance cut deep. Robert kept carving in the garage alone, the extra chisel gathering dust on the workbench. He planted the marigolds by himself each spring, pretending the silence was just another season to endure. Sometimes, late at night, he'd take out the old sketch Daniel had drawn at 7 years old, a crooked house with windows too big and a roof too steep, but with a little stick figure smiling out front. Underneath, in blocky letters, Daniel had written, "For Papa." Robert folded the paper carefully each time, sliding it back into the drawer like a relic from a faith he was struggling to hold on to. Still, he never gave up on the boy. He remembered how Daniel once spoke about becoming an architect, about designing buildings that would touch the sky. Even when the boy stopped talking about it, Robert believed for him. He began putting money aside, quietly, month after month. Every coupon clipped, every jacket worn an extra year, every prescription delayed. It all went into a folder labeled College Fund. He didn't tell Daniel, didn't tell Michael, didn't tell anyone. It was his secret covenant, his way of saying, "I believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself." Daniel's life moved faster than Robert's eyes could keep up with. The boy was growing into a man, sharp edges forming where softness had been, a hunger for the world carving him away from the man who had raised him. Robert kept watching, kept hoping, even when visits grew shorter, calls less frequent, gratitude replaced by expectation. The marigolds still bloomed in the yard, but Daniel no longer bent down to touch them. The garage smelled of sawdust, but the sound of laughter was gone. Robert carried it all in silence. The house that had once echoed with footsteps and questions now hummed only with the ticking of the kitchen clock and the groan of old pipes. He sat on the porch in the evenings, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug, remembering the little boy who once clung to his hand and begged him not to let go. But children grow, and loyalty fades when tested by the glitters of the world. Robert knew this truth better than most, yet the sting of it never dulled. He told himself love was enough, that no matter how far Daniel wandered, the boy would remember the man who had taught him patience and persistence, the man who had sacrificed without asking for thanks. Still, somewhere in the hollow of his chest, doubt grew louder. He saw how easily love could be dismissed, how quickly sacrifice could be forgotten. And he wondered, as he ran his hand over the smooth wood of another carving, if the boy he had raised as his own would ever understand what it cost to give so much of yourself and receive only silence in return. The question lingered like a shadow at his shoulder, heavy and unrelenting, as if the years of sacrifice had been nothing more than kindling, waiting for a cruel spark. And Robert sensed, though he didn't yet know how, that the test of that love was coming, a test that would reveal whether Daniel had ever truly seen him at all. The distance didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like frost slipping through the cracks of an old window. One year Daniel was still running barefoot across the lawn, swinging sticks like swords, begging Robert to play along. The next, his eyes were downcast, into glowing screens, laughter sealed inside earbuds, his words clipped and hurried as though every second spent in Robert's presence was borrowed time. The marigolds still bloomed, the wood shavings still curled on the garage floor, but Daniel no longer noticed. Childhood's magic was replaced by a new world Robert could not enter, a digital kingdom where his stories, his lessons, his very voice carried no weight. Robert tried to hold on. He sat through dinners where Daniel scrolled endlessly, nodding at nothing. He asked questions, simple ones about school or friends, and got one-word answers. The boy who once curled against his side during thunderstorms now stayed locked in his room, screen light glowing under the crack of the door until dawn. Robert felt the silence like a second skin, but he told himself it was natural, part of growing up. Kids drift, they said. Don't take it to heart. But every time Daniel walked out the door, without looking back, it felt like something sharp had been left behind in Robert's chest. And yet, he never stopped believing in the boy. He carried memories like lanterns against the dark. He remembered the sketches Daniel once drew of tall towers, crooked but ambitious, and the way his small voice had said he wanted to touch the sky one day. Even when Daniel stopped drawing, Robert kept that dream alive. He never mentioned it out loud, But the image of his grandson standing before a skyline he built became a private promise. It was why he opened that college fund. Every dollar folded into that folder was a prayer that Daniel's future would be bigger than the small house in Burlington, bigger than the limits Robert had accepted for himself. It wasn't easy. Each month the sacrifice cut deeper. He skipped new jackets when the winters grew harsher, let the house grow cold to shave a few dollars off the heating bill, ate soup made from leftovers stretched too thin. He told himself it didn't matter. Every number added to the account was worth it. He could picture the day Daniel would discover it, the gratitude in his eyes, the recognition that every hardship had been for him. That hope kept Robert steady when the loneliness gnawed at him. But as the years passed, hope had to fight harder to survive. Daniel no longer spent holidays by his side. The birthdays Robert once decorated with balloons and homemade cakes became glossy events thrown by others, where Robert sat in the back like an afterthought. Michael drifted too, caught in his own world of work and obligations, leaving Robert a relic, a presence nobody quite knew what to do with. Robert felt the weight of invisibility. He became a ghost in his own family gatherings, present but unseen, giving but unacknowledged. He told himself it was enough just to be near Daniel, even if the boy barely looked up from his phone, even if the laughter that once filled the house now lived somewhere he couldn't reach. Still, in quiet moments, he wondered if love alone could hold back the tide of indifference. One evening, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, Robert stared at the folder tucked into the drawer. He ran his hand over it, feeling the years etched into the paper edges. Inside were not just receipts and bank slips, but pieces of himself, his strength, his warmth, his sacrifices pressed into numbers on a page. He imagined Daniel finding it one day and finally seeing him not as the quiet old man in the corner, but as the reason his dreams had a chance to live. But belief has its limits. Robert began to notice the sharpness in Daniel's tone, the quick dismissals, the growing sense that gratitude was being replaced with expectation. It wasn't, "Thank you, Papa," anymore. It was silence, or worse, entitlement. The boy he had raised with tenderness now seemed to wear arrogance like a second skin. Robert tried to ignore it, tried to see past the surface, but the echoes of what had been and what was now collided inside him. Still, he clung to the memory of that small boy, the one who once drew crooked towers and smiled like the world was his to claim. He convinced himself Daniel was still in there, buried under layers of pride and distraction. He thought maybe one day the boy would remember, maybe he would come back. That faith became Robert's anchor, even as disappointment pulled at him. The house grew quieter. Robert carved alone in the garage, his hand still steady, but his heart heavier. He planted marigolds without Daniel's help, kneeling in the dirt with knees that ached more each spring. The silence pressed harder against the walls, thick and suffocating. Yet in that silence, Robert whispered the same vow. It would all be worth it when Daniel finally understood. But deep down, he felt the unease of a man who had given everything and received only absence. He saw how love could be taken for granted, how sacrifice could be mistaken for weakness. And though he didn't want to admit it, he began to sense the truth. The boy he had raised as his own might never see the cost, might never look at him with the gratitude he had dreamed of. That question lingered, dark and sharp, each time Robert folded another dollar into the account. Would Daniel ever truly understand the price of devotion? Or was Robert building a future for someone who no longer saw him at all? The answer waited in the shadows, closer than he realized, and it carried with it a storm he was not yet ready to face. For 12 long years, Robert carried his secret like a stone in his pocket, heavy but necessary. Each month he opened his pension envelope and set aside a portion before the bills were paid, before groceries were bought, before he even allowed himself a thought of comfort. It wasn't much at first, 20 here, 50 there, but over time it grew into something larger than numbers. It became a living record of every small sacrifice, a map of how far he was willing to go for the boy he loved. He skipped Sunday roasts and made do with thin soups. He wore the same boots until the leather cracked, patching them with glue and stubbornness. Winters bit harder when he kept the thermostat low, wrapping himself in extra blankets and telling himself the shivers were worth it. Each sacrifice whispered the same vow. Daniel's future would not be limited by the quiet walls of Burlington or by the struggles his father could never overcome. The folder grew thicker with bank slips and receipts tucked away in the back of his desk. He never spoke of it, not to Michael, not to Daniel, not to anyone. To the outside world, Robert was just a retired carpenter living modestly, a man who had learned to make peace with simplicity. But hidden in that folder was a promise carved from bone-deep devotion. He imagined one day placing it in Daniel's hands, watching the boy's eyes fill with awe, the moment of recognition when he would understand that every skipped meal, every cold night, every lonely hour had been for him. Robert rehearsed the scene in his mind countless times. In his imagination, Daniel's voice trembled with gratitude, calling him Papa the way he used to, holding him tight and finally seeing him not as an aging relic, but as the man who had given him the sky. And yet, beneath the dream, lay doubt. Each year Daniel drifted further, visiting less, calling rarely, his words growing shorter as his world grew louder. Robert told himself the sacrifices still mattered, that someday Daniel would come back to himself, back to the boy who once sketched crooked towers and spoke of touching the clouds. But the silence pressed harder against Robert's chest, and the folder in his desk became both hope and wound. Sometimes at night he would pull it out, lay the slips across the table, and run his fingers over them as if they were relics of devotion. Each number reminded him of the choices he had made. $50 that could have repaired the roof. $100 that might have bought a new water heater before the old one groaned itself to death. He told himself it was all temporary, that the boy's future outweighed the present discomfort. He had lived lean before. He could do it again. What mattered was Daniel, and Daniel alone. Robert found strange comfort in the secrecy. To keep such a vow hidden gave it weight, made it feel sacred. He would watch Daniel scroll through his phone at the dinner table, shoulders hunched and eyes blank, and tell himself the boy didn't need to know yet. Not until the moment was right, not until he was ready to receive the truth. Hope is a dangerous thing, but it was the only fire Robert had left to warm himself against the cold. Years blurred together. Holidays passed in muted tones, Daniel showing up late or not at all, Michael distracted and tired, leaving Robert to sit alone at the head of the table, carving turkey for no one. Still he saved, still he believed. His love was stubborn, carved from the same wood that built his home and his hands. He told himself love was enough, even when evidence pointed otherwise. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the wind pressed hard against the windows, he felt the weight of invisibility. He wondered if Daniel would ever understand that love wasn't just words spoken at birthdays or holidays. Love was a man walking into the cold, feeling hunger gnaw at his stomach, and telling himself it didn't matter as long as the boy had a chance. Love was the quiet surrender of your own comfort, year after year, with no guarantee of gratitude in return. By the 12th year, the fund was no longer just savings. It was Robert's heart, beaten and worn, but still alive. He had poured into it more than money. He had poured his dignity, his belief, his need to matter. The folder in the desk was proof that he had not lived his life in vain, that his sacrifices meant something beyond silence. Yet as he closed the drawer one evening and sat at the kitchen table with his chipped mug of coffee, another thought slipped in, one that chilled him more than the draft from the window. What if the boy never saw? What if the moment never came? What if all those sacrifices were nothing more than offerings left at the altar of someone who no longer cared to look? The question lingered, sharp and unrelenting, as he stared into the steam rising from his cup. He told himself not to dwell, but the thought gnawed at him, a shadow growing longer with each passing day. And deep inside, though he tried to bury it, Robert knew the truth. The real test was coming, and when it did, he would learn whether 12 years of sacrifice had been the foundation of a future or the slow construction of his own heartbreak. Robert remembered the way Daniel's small hands once sketched towers on scrap paper, crooked lines climbing higher than the page itself, windows drawn uneven but filled with light. The boy had said he wanted to be an architect, that one day he would design buildings so tall they would touch the sky. Robert never forgot. He carried that dream even after Daniel stopped speaking of it, even after the drawings were replaced by phone screens and earbuds. He told himself that the silence didn't mean the dream was gone, only buried under the noise of youth. So he kept saving, each dollar folded into the account like a brick in the foundation of a future he believed in more than the boy did himself. California felt impossibly far from their small Vermont town, a place where the winters clung to bone and the streets fell quiet after dusk. But Robert pictured it clearly. Daniel stepping off a plane with his head held high, walking into studios with blueprints under his arm, standing in front of professors who saw the same potential Robert had always seen. He could imagine the pride in his grandson's face, the kind that came from building something out of nothing. The thought fueled him through long nights when the wind rattled the windows and his body ached with age. Robert never told Daniel about the fund. Some truths were meant to arrive like gifts, not obligations. He wanted the moment to matter. He wanted the boy to understand that while the world had moved on, while friends had come and gone, while even his own father drifted under the weight of his choices, there had always been one man who believed in him enough to sacrifice everything. He pictured Daniel's face when he would hand him the folder, the gratitude in his eyes, the long-awaited recognition that every cold winter, every skipped meal, every patched boot had been for him. That day, Robert believed, would be worth every lonely year. But dreams are fragile things, and hope can turn sharp when pressed too long against reality. Robert began to notice changes, subtle at first, then louder. Daniel spoke of money casually, as though it were endless, as though it came without effort. He mocked Robert's old truck, asked why he never bought new clothes, brushed off the reminders of how hard life could press when you weren't careful. Robert said little, swallowing his unease, but inside he felt the edges of worry. Would the boy who once dreamed of architecture ever understand the architecture of sacrifice that had built his chance? Still, he pressed forward. Belief had been Robert's companion all his life. It was what had carried him through widowhood, through raising children who too often mistook his silence for weakness, through nights alone, when the only sound was the clock ticking in the kitchen. Belief that tomorrow might still hold meaning, that people could change, that love could still matter. He believed in Daniel with the same stubbornness, telling himself that arrogance was a mask, that beneath it lived the boy who once clung to his hand and begged him not to let go. The folder swelled with years. Sometimes Robert would take it out late at night, spread the slips across the table, and stare at them as though they were blueprints themselves. Each line was proof that he had chosen to give, proof that he had turned his own life into scaffolding for Daniel's future. He imagined that one day the boy might lay out his own blueprints beside them, the old sacrifices and the new dreams meeting in quiet recognition. The thought steadied him, even as doubts gnawed deeper. Because deep down, Robert knew something had shifted. The boy who once drew crooked towers no longer looked toward the sky. His ambitions had blurred into something smaller, something hungrier. His words carried less about creation and more about possession. And though Robert tried to ignore it, to drown it out with memory, he could feel the truth pressing against him. Still, he refused to let go. He told himself love meant persistence, that sacrifice was wasted only if you stopped too soon. He planted marigolds alone each spring, carved wood in silence, and tucked away another month's savings into the folder. He thought of California, of Daniel walking under the sun, and told himself it would be worth it, that the boy would see, eventually, that the dream was still alive, even if only one of them carried it. But in the back of his mind, another question grew louder, one he tried not to face as he closed the drawer on the folder each night. What if the dream no longer belonged to Daniel? What if he had built an entire future on a foundation that no one else wanted? The thought lingered, sharp and cold, waiting for the moment it would no longer be ignored. And when the truth finally came, it would strike harder than any winter, colder than any silence, and Robert's sacrifices would be tested in ways he had never imagined. Robert worked on the gift with the devotion of a man who understood that love was measured not in grand gestures, but in the small, steady strokes of memory. The swing had been Daniel's sanctuary when he was little, the place he ran to after scraped knees or long summer afternoons. Robert could still hear the chains creak as Daniel's laughter filled the yard, Buddy circling below, with his tail wagging like a metronome of joy. That oak tree had stood for generations, its roots gripping the soil with quiet strength, just as Robert had gripped the boy's life when everything else around him faltered. He carved until his wrists ached, until his back stiffened, until the wood surrendered to his vision. The grain became the curve of the swing. The knots became the shadows of leaves. The shape became a memory locked into something solid. When it was finished, he tied the white satin ribbon with care, his handwriting trembling slightly on the card, but his message steady. The morning of Daniel's birthday, Robert placed the box gently on the seat of his truck. The house was cold, as it often was by choice, but he barely noticed. He imagined Daniel opening it, the recognition lighting in his eyes, the boy seeing not just wood and ribbon, but the years of love hidden in every line. Robert could already hear Daniel's voice softening, maybe even breaking, as he said thank you. That thought warmed him more than the furnace ever could. The drive to the party was long enough for doubt to creep in. He had seen Daniel's world grow shinier, faster, filled with gadgets and clothes that screamed wealth Robert never had. His gift was small, simple, carved from memory rather than money. He wondered if it would stand against the weight of expectation, against the laughter of Daniel's friends who didn't know what it meant to go, without so someone else could have more. Still, he told himself love would cut through the noise. It had to. When he arrived, the scene hit him like a cold wind. White tents stretched across the lawn, linen tables glimmered beneath strings of lights, and a DJ's bass rattled the air. Catered dishes replaced the homemade meals Robert remembered from birthdays past, when balloons clung to the ceiling with tape, and Daniel had grinned frosting across his face from a cake baked in their own kitchen. This was different. It was polished, loud, built on spectacle. He stood at the edge of it all in his cardigan and worn shoes. The box clutched to his chest like it might shatter if he loosened his grip. Daniel moved through the crowd like someone Robert barely recognized. The pink dress shirt, the designer shoes, the way he laughed too loudly, surrounded by friends who treated him like a star. Robert's presence went unnoticed at first, swallowed by the noise. When Michael finally spotted him, his son's smile was polite but distant, the kind reserved for strangers you greet out of obligation. Robert handed him a nod, nothing more, and kept his eyes on Daniel. The gift table overflowed with glossy boxes wrapped in metallic paper, ribbons curled to perfection, bags stamped with designer names Robert had never spoken aloud. He placed his package among them, plain brown paper and satin ribbon, a humble shadow against the glittering tower. For a moment, he wondered if it would be better to pull it back, to give it privately, to protect the intimacy of what it meant. But something inside him refused. Daniel needed to see it, needed to understand it, in front of everyone. When the time came to open gifts, the crowd circled close, phones lifted high to record every moment. Daniel tore through the glossy boxes first, holding up sneakers that cost more than Robert's truck payment, gadgets that gleamed beneath the lights, envelopes thick with cash. The cheers and laughter rolled with each reveal, the kind of joy money bought easily. Then his hand landed on Robert's package. For the first time that night, silence crept in. Daniel peeled back the paper, the ribbon falling loose, and lifted the wooden carving from its box. For a flicker of a second, Robert swore he saw recognition flash in his grandson's eyes. The memory of summers past, of Buddy's bark, of the oak tree's shade. But it vanished as quickly as it came. A laugh slipped from Daniel's lips, sharp and cruel. "A wooden swing? Are you serious? Cheaper than buying something real." His friends erupted into snickers, one muttering, "Vintage vibes, I guess." The carving was set aside against the table leg, dismissed, forgotten among the piles of excess. The crowd surged forward again, chasing the next shiny reveal. No one noticed Robert standing frozen, his chest hollowing out as if someone had driven a nail straight through it. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, invisible in the noise, watching the gift he had poured his soul into, treated like scrap. He left quietly, the laughter still echoing in his ears long after he closed the truck door. Each step back to the car felt heavier than the last, as though he carried all 12 years of sacrifice on his shoulders at once. In the driver's seat, he gripped the wheel, but didn't start the engine. His hands trembled, his eyes burned, and a single tear slid down to rest on his wedding band. The same hands that had held Daniel steady on his first bicycle, the same hands that had carved memories into wood, now shook with the weight of rejection. The house was silent when he returned, darker than usual, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest. He didn't bother with the lights. He poured a glass of water into a chipped cup and sat at the same table where he once helped Daniel with homework, where crayons once stained the surface with bright dreams. The corner where his tools rested looked abandoned now, brushes dried, chisels untouched since the day he finished the carving. He stared at the empty space and felt the echo of what had been mocked as cheap. Robert's breath came slow, deliberate. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it something else stirred, something sharper. He rose from the table, walked to the drawer, and pulled out the thick folder marked College Fund. Inside was 12 years of sacrifice. Every skipped winter coat, every meal stretched too thin, every doctor's visit delayed. He carried it to the desk, opened his old computer, and logged into the bank. The numbers blinked back at him. He stared for a long time, the silence of the house holding him steady. Then, with one deliberate motion, he transferred it all into his own account. It wasn't spite. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. A choice he had denied himself for far too long. For once, Robert chose himself. He sat back, sipping tea laced with honey, letting the quiet settle into his chest like an unfamiliar kind of peace. But peace has its own price, and as he stared into the dark, he knew this was only the beginning. What Daniel had mocked wasn't just a wooden carving. It was love itself, dismissed as worthless, and the truth of that betrayal would unravel in ways neither of them yet understood. The tent shimmered under strings of lights, laughter rolling through the air as though money itself had hired the sound. Tables lined in white linen stretched across the lawn, silver trays heavy with food Robert couldn't name, waiters gliding through the crowd in pressed shirts and polished shoes. The DJ's bass thudded like a heartbeat too loud for conversation, rattling plates and nerves alike. It was a celebration of excess, a display of wealth and image, the kind of party Robert had only ever seen in magazines left behind in waiting rooms. He stood at the edge, shoulders stooped in his worn cardigan, the small package clutched against his chest like something fragile in a storm. Around him, Daniel moved like a star in his own orbit. The boy's shirt gleamed pale pink beneath the lights. His smile stretched wide and practiced. His friends swarming with phones in hand, recording every flick of his hand, every laugh that broke too sharp. Robert tried to find traces of the child he once knew, the one who used to run barefoot across the yard. But the boy was gone, hidden beneath cologne and arrogance. No one turned toward him. No one noticed the old man holding his heart inside a box. The gift table sagged under the weight of designer packages, glossy paper folded into perfect corners, satin ribbons curled into flourishes. Logos screamed louder than the DJ's speakers, names Robert couldn't pronounce but recognized as the currency of status. He placed his own box among them, the brown paper plain, the white ribbon trembling where his hands had tied it. Against the glittering tower of wealth, it looked small, almost invisible, but to Robert it was the only thing on the table that held any real weight. When the time came for Daniel to open gifts, the crowd pressed in close, phones lifted high, ready to broadcast the moment to anyone willing to watch. Robert stood just behind the circle, half in shadow, his heart steady but heavy. Daniel tore into each package with careless speed, pulling out sleek gadgets, leather wallets, expensive sneakers. Each reveal earned gasps, whistles, and cheers, the kind of noise made for show. The boy smiled wide, playing to the cameras, feeding the crowd. Then his hands fell on Robert's package. For the first time that night, silence spread. Daniel glanced at the plain wrapping, frowned slightly, then tugged at the ribbon. The paper tore easily, revealing the wooden model inside. He lifted it out, holding it in both hands as though unsure what it was. Robert leaned forward slightly, breath held, waiting for the flicker of recognition. The moment memory would strike, and the boy would remember the oak tree, the swing, the golden retriever, long gone. For an instant, Daniel's eyes softened. For an instant, Robert saw the child again. Then came the laugh. A wooden swing? Seriously? Daniel's voice carried above the crowd, sharp and mocking. Cheaper than buying something real. His friends roared with laughter, one muttering about vintage vibes, while another filmed the moment with a smirk. The carving, the weeks of work, the years of memory, was set aside carelessly against the table leg, half hidden behind boxes that cost more than Robert's yearly pension. The crowd moved on, eager for the next shiny gift. No one saw Robert's face. That was the curse of invisibility. You could stand in the center of humiliation and still be unseen. His hands hung useless at his sides, the echo of laughter still sharp in his ears. He wanted to speak, to remind the boy of the nights spent planting marigolds, of the summers on the swing, of Buddy's bark under the branches of that oak. But his throat closed, and no sound came. He stood still until his legs carried him backward, step by step, away from the lights, away from the noise, away from the boy who had forgotten him. The walk to his truck felt longer than the years he had spent raising Daniel. Each step dragged behind it the weight of 12 winters spent in the cold to save a little more, of 12 summers passed without new boots so Daniel could dream. He slid into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. He didn't cry, not loudly, just one tear that rolled slow and fell onto the gold band around his finger, the last trace of a love he had already buried once before. The road home blurred in the dark. His headlights cut through empty streets, the world around him oblivious to the wreckage inside his chest. When he reached the house, he didn't bother with the lights. The silence inside greeted him like an old friend. He set the keys on the counter, poured water into a chipped cup, and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel once scrawled math problems and asked what color to use in his drawings. The same table where Robert had whispered silent prayers over bills so the boy could have shoes for school. The corner of the room still held his tools, brushes and stains scattered around the easel where he had finished the carving. He stared at the empty space where the gift had once rested. Weeks of aching wrists and sleepless nights now reduced to a forgotten prop at the base of a table. Daniel had called it cheap. But Robert knew the truth. It wasn't the carving Daniel rejected. It was him. The thought settled cold and sharp. He rose slowly, walked to the hallway, and pulled open the drawer where the thick folder waited. Inside were 12 years of sacrifice, every bank slip and receipt, every piece of proof that love had been measured in dollars he never had to spare. He carried it to the desk, powered up his old computer, and logged into the account. The numbers blinked on the screen, steady and unforgiving. He stared at them a long time, the laughter from the party still echoing in his ears. Then, with hands steady now, he clicked transfer. The progress bar crept forward, asking silently if he might change his mind. He didn't. The money slid into his personal account, not for Daniel, not for a dream that had been mocked into dust. For once, it was for him. He closed the folder, shut the drawer, and turned off the computer. The decision was quiet, but in that silence lived a finality sharper than rage. He brewed tea properly with honey and sat at the table. The house hummed with emptiness, but the noise in his chest had gone still. He didn't feel powerful, didn't feel triumphant. He just felt done. Done with waiting, done with hoping, done with being invisible. But deep in the silence, another thought stirred, one that made his chest tighten. The story wasn't finished. Daniel had mocked the carving, but the carving was more than wood. It was proof. Proof of love dismissed as worthless. And when proof is ignored, truth has a way of forcing itself into the light, no matter the cost. The laugh cut sharper than any knife, echoing in Robert's chest long after the noise of the party swallowed it whole. Daniel's voice, mocking and careless, carried across the tent with a cruelty that pierced deeper than words ever should. His friends chimed in, their chuckles rising in a chorus that drowned out the silence Robert tried to hold inside. The carving, weeks of aching wrists and sleepless nights, sat abandoned against the leg of the gift table, forgotten among glossy boxes that gleamed like trophies. It wasn't just a piece of wood tossed aside. It was years of sacrifice, memories carved into every curve, dismissed as worthless in front of strangers who would never understand. Robert didn't move. His body stood rooted in the ground while the crowd surged forward, eager for the next luxury reveal. No one noticed him there, not even Michael, who smiled weakly and looked away, unwilling to challenge his son's laughter. That was the curse of invisibility. You could bleed in plain sight, and the world would step over you without pause. Robert's face remained calm, his eyes steady, but inside a storm raged. It wasn't anger that burned. It was something colder, a recognition that love given too freely can become a weapon turned against you. The rest of the gifts were opened with cheers and applause, but Robert no longer heard them. The sound dulled to a muffled hum, the kind you hear underwater, as if the whole world had slipped just beyond his reach. He stepped back, then back again. until the tent's lights blurred into a haze. His legs carried him across the lawn, slow but deliberate, each step heavier than the last. When he reached his truck, the laughter still rang in his ears, sharper now in the silence of night. He slid into the driver's seat, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and let them rest there. His knuckles whitened against the cracked leather, his breath shallow and even. And then one tear slipped down and landed on the wedding band he still wore. The road home stretched empty, his headlights cutting through the dark. Every turn felt familiar, the same streets he had driven for decades. But tonight they felt foreign, hostile. The house greeted him with silence when he opened the door, the kind that doesn't comfort but accuses. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he walked straight to the kitchen, filled a chipped mug with water, and sat at the table. The same table where Daniel once drew crooked houses with crayons, where math homework was solved under the low hum of the lamp, where whispered prayers over unpaid bills had kept hope alive. Now it was just a slab of wood in a dark room, bearing witness to the collapse of years. His eyes drifted to the corner where his tools rested, brushes dried stiff, chisels scattered, the workbench still holding the ghost of the carving that had been mocked. It wasn't just the gift that Daniel rejected. Robert understood it now. It was him, his love, his devotion, his sacrifices. All of it had been reduced to a joke at the hands of the boy he had raised as his own. He stood slowly, his joints stiff but his movements precise, and walked down the hallway to the desk. He pulled open the drawer and slid out the thick folder. It was heavier than he remembered, stuffed with slips of paper, deposit records, evidence of 12 years spent denying himself so Daniel could have a chance. He carried it to the desk, booted up his old computer, and typed in the password he had used for over a decade. The screen blinked awake, revealing the balance of the account. Robert stared at the numbers, his reflection faint in the glow of the monitor. Every dollar was a story, every cent a scar. Nights spent hungry, winters endured without heat, boots worn until the soles cracked. All of it sat there, waiting for a boy who had laughed in his face. His hand hovered for a moment, but only a moment. Then he clicked transfer. The bar crawled across the screen, slow, deliberate, as though asking if he wanted to change his mind. He didn't. The money shifted from the college fund into his personal account, erasing 12 years of expectation in the time it took to exhale. He shut the folder, closed the drawer, and turned off the computer. The silence in the house deepened, but for the first time in years, it wasn't suffocating. It was clean. He made tea, added honey, and sat in the quiet. No guilt gnawed at him. No hesitation clawed at his chest. What he felt wasn't triumph, but something sharper, something steadier. He wasn't doing this out of spite. He wasn't doing it for revenge. He was doing it because love without respect was poison, and he had been drinking it for too long. Yet peace never lingers for long. As Robert sat at the table, the tea warming his hands, another thought began to surface. The humiliation at the party had been public, loud, unforgettable, but betrayal rarely ends in one moment. What Daniel had shown was only the surface, the visible crack in a foundation Robert had spent years building. He knew, deep in his bones, that more was coming. And when it came, it would not just challenge his patience or his pride. It would test the very core of who he had been, who he had become, and who he was finally willing to be. The engine sat cold beneath his hands, the key waiting but untouched. Robert's breath fogged the windshield as he leaned forward, both palms pressed hard against the steering wheel, veins straining under the pressure. That single tear clung to the gold band on his finger, glimmering in the dim street light that bled through the glass. It wasn't just about the carving tossed aside or the laughter that still echoed in his ears. It was about a lifetime of giving, of carving himself hollow so others could stand tall, only to realize that his love had been dismissed as disposable. His most honest gift, born of memory and devotion, had not been mocked for what it was. It had been mocked because it came from him. The drive home blurred in silence. The streets, so familiar, stretched on like a punishment. Every stop sign, every turn, felt heavier than the last. He remembered carrying Daniel's small body asleep from that very truck years ago, tucking him into bed, whispering goodnight. Now he drove alone, headlights slicing through empty dark. The boy grown into a stranger who could laugh at him without a second thought. By the time the house came into view, Robert's chest was tight, not with rage, but with a cold clarity. Something inside had shifted. He stepped into the house without turning on the lights. The silence wrapped itself around him, not warm, not forgiving, but relentless. He set his keys down, poured water into a chipped mug, and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Daniel once practiced spelling, where marigold petals once scattered from little hands eager to help. Now the wood grain beneath his fingers felt foreign, as though it belonged to someone else's life. The air was heavy, thick with ghosts of what had been. His gaze drifted toward the corner where his workbench stood, tools lined neatly, though untouched. The chisels, the brushes, the wood stains, they all bore witness to weeks of aching wrists and sleepless nights spent crafting the carving. He saw the empty space where it had rested, remembered the way his hands had trembled tying the ribbon, the way his heart had lifted when he imagined Daniel's gratitude. That hope felt foolish now, naive, as though he had been speaking a language no one in his family cared to understand. Robert rose slowly, the weight of years pressing against his spine, and walked down the hallway. His hand found the drawer without hesitation. Inside lay the thick folder, swollen with receipts and bank slips, every line a record of sacrifice. He carried it back to the desk, powered up the old computer, and typed in the password. The glow of the screen lit his face in harsh relief, etching deep lines into his features. The numbers blinked at him, cold, exact, indifferent. For 12 years that account had been a promise. Every dollar meant hunger endured, heat denied, boots patched, dreams deferred. It was more than money. It was proof that his love had substance, that devotion could be measured in the weight of sacrifice. But tonight, staring at the balance, Robert felt the truth settle hard. That love had not been honored. It had been mocked. The boy he had raised, the boy he had given his strength to, had tossed it aside with a laugh. His finger hovered over the keys only for a breath. Then he clicked transfer. The progress bar crawled across the screen, taunting him with hesitation, but he did not falter. The money slid into his personal account, erasing 12 years of devotion in a single motion. The folder closed with a soft thud, final as a coffin lid. He made tea with honey, sat again at the table, and let the quiet press in. No guilt followed him. No regret clawed at his chest. What he felt was cleaner, sharper, a decision carved from humiliation's edge. For once, he had chosen himself. Not Daniel, not Michael, not the family who only remembered him when they needed something. Just Robert. Yet as the tea cooled in his hands, he understood something else. Humiliation doesn't end when the laughter fades. It festers, it spreads, it waits for the next crack to split the ground wide. Daniel's laugh was not the end of the betrayal. It was only the first fracture, and Robert, though he didn't yet know the form it would take, could feel the storm gathering. What had been dismissed as cheap was more than wood. It was love itself. And when love is treated as worthless, the reckoning that follows does not arrive gently. It arrives like a hammer, ready to break what remains. Life has a way of teaching us that love without respect is not love at all. Robert's story reminds us that sacrifice, no matter how deep or enduring, loses its meaning when it is taken for granted. Too often, parents and grandparents give quietly, believing that their devotion will one day be recognized. But silence can turn into invisibility, and when appreciation is replaced by entitlement, the wound is deeper than words can express. The lesson is not to stop loving, but to remember that dignity must walk hand in hand with devotion. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is necessary, especially when others forget the value of your presence and your sacrifices. For those in their later years, it is a reminder that your worth is not measured by what others take from you, but by the strength you keep for yourself. Protect your heart, protect your peace, and never allow anyone, not even family, to dismiss the life you've built. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Where are you watching from today?